Thank you very much for inviting me to come here. And I have to say, this is an event I've been looking forward to for quite a long time because, well, as you'll see, there is so much similarity between the work of us two here today and our teams, and the fact that in London and Paris they sort of sit opposite each other. I think is going to be really intriguing. Not to mention, of course, that downstairs there are some things to be tasted and experienced that are really going to blow your minds. But before I talk about that, can I just say a bit about the Institute of Making at UCL, which, well, in fact, no, I don't want to. I'm going to say at the end about how we ended up calling it that and creating this entity. But first, I want to tell you a bit about how we got there. And that can't be said enough, really, because I'm going to talk a lot about materials, and a lot about engineering and making, and the overlap with the arts and designing communities. But actually, the thing we've discovered most after 10 years of doing all this is that it's the people. It's the people you get in a room together or do a project together that are the most important ingredient of all. And I've been working with Zoe and Martin for 10 years now, who are co-founders of the Institute, and we've got lots of new people involved with us. Sarah, who's here, and Ellie's here. And all these people have different backgrounds. So Sarah's an anthropologist, Ellie, artist, Supinia, who's a PhD student, is from a jewellery background, Philip from physics, Harry from psychology. And I think this is the key, is that you've got different people. Martin's a designer, I'm a material scientist engineer, and the question is, what can those people do together when they get together in a space? So what is the space? Well, it could be just be a street. You could just be walking down the street, and you might sort of play a game, and you might just spot different materials. And it doesn't really take very long before you've, realised that actually the world we live in, even in a mundane street like this, is full of materials, and each one of those is a wonderful substance. Each one of those was a revolution in its own time. So you name the ages of civilization after materials, and here they are, without amalgams, toothache, was a constant problem for our ancestors. I don't know if any of you have been to the dentist recently, because you sort of forget, don't you? You sort of forget, you live in this world where your teeth are fine until they ache, and then you think, there's one person who can sort this out for me and relieve me of that pain, and it's going to be the dentist. You go to the dentist, and you're going to get some sort of material filling in there, or you're going to have a tooth removed. Now, that's quite a new invention. And so all of these materials around here, the materials that, of the screen, this wall, this carpet, this screen, I'm looking at my clothes, each one of those was discovered and built by different people and has kind of created this wonderful world that we live in. And yet, we all screen them out. You have to. Because if you sort of went around the world going, lovely concrete, you would be thought of as mad. And you are allowed to do it in the Royal Academy of Engineering. Now, where did these materials come from? Well, the explanation from science and engineering is that we built them by thinking really deeply about them. And this is the standard explanation of how you explain different materials' properties. And it's really about scale. So you've got nature on the left here and the man-made world on the right. And nature builds materials, really good materials. Nature builds woods, it builds skin, teeth, and you can see these giant trees, whales, mice. And as you get smaller and smaller, you can focus on different materials. Hair is one of the best materials around, very, very versatile. And they're all built of tissues, so multicellular things. And each of those tissues is built of individual cells. And the cell is an amazing building block. It is probably the most miraculous, magical building block of them all. If we could get close to building an artificial cell, which we could do what nature can do, which is diversify into things that are like ceramics, like bone, or into woods, which are essentially plastics, or into skin, which are sort of these flexible membranes, how does it do it? And we're a long way from understanding that. But essentially, the idea is that these different hierarchical scales all contribute to those materials' properties, and understanding those allows you to understand not just how we can stand up and how we can breathe and how birds can fly, but you can understand disease. So one of the miraculous things about the biological world is that these scales all talk to each other. So things don't magically happen at different scales. A gene doesn't suddenly change down here and suddenly you get blue eyes. Actually, it changes the cell types. They develop into different tissues, which then create these different things. So that's extraordinary. But on the other side, we've been having a go at it ourselves. I say we, you guys and us. And we've kind of come quite a long way with skyscrapers, robots, phones, tiny little wires inside phones, incredible MEMS devices. We understand about crystals, which come in various shapes and sizes. We understand that if you change the crystal shape and size, you change the properties of the material. You can change whether a metal is strong or weak. You can alter the properties of a bridge. You can make single crystals like this silicon transistor. You can make computers then. Or you can make nanostructures, which are the size of the inside of a cell. And these things self-assemble and self-heal. And you can even fiddle around the actual atoms themselves. So we kind of covered all the different scales, and yet we can't quite do something as good as nature can do. We can do some cool stuff, but not quite as much as nature can do. So essentially, I've rushed through it because I've got a lot to cover. That's the standard way of explaining, A, how to get to new materials, new structures, and B, how we can sort of take inspiration from nature. But there's a problem. That it doesn't really explain everything, because although if we take glass, for instance, we can identify different structural scales which explain some of the amazing properties of glass. Like, has anyone here got those transition lenses on, the ones that turn different colours in the light or the dark? You have. Are you happy with them?
Not all the time.
Not all the time? What's wrong with them?
Well, if you go from a bright sunlight into a darker room, you can't see.
It doesn't happen immediately, does it? Yeah, you can't see. Well, what's happening is little crystals of silver halides are forming inside your glass. So solid-state crystals are forming inside a solid material, which is an amazing thing to have discovered. It's like photography, essentially, but it doesn't happen instantaneously. So the glasses you want, which are coming, are electrochromic glass, which change their tint with an electric field across them. And the Boeing Dreamliner has those. And the tint glasses, they rely on structures that look like this, little crystals. The electrochromic glass relies on sort of changing the electron state, which is much more of a quantum mechanics effect. And this all seems very plausible, that we can invent a new future by just fiddling around with these different scales. We've managed to understand glass. We can make it bulletproof. We can make it change colour. We can even make it stronger, so we have huge sheets of it, and we can make skyscrapers out of it. So what's to learn from anyone else, I hear you asking? Well, the thing is, we didn't invent most of these glasses. That's the problem with the story. The story starts much further back in ancient Egyptian times with glass. And this is a brooch from Tutankhamun, and it has at its center, which is a very important part of it, not a diamond, not an emerald, a piece of glass. And they didn't really know how to make fully transparent glass. They picked it up from the desert. It's called desert glass when lightning hits the sand. And there's some particularly pure parts of quartz in the Libyan desert. And they revered glass. It had this transformation power. You can see why taking sand and making something translucent that had beautiful optical qualities was very attractive to them. And then the Chinese took it on. They developed all sorts of amazing glazes. So these are amazing, just incredible skill. So these are the glazes on the outside of their pots. And they were able to get them to essentially go through phase transitions to get little spots called, these are oil spots, but they're little growth phases. And they were also able to control the bubbles in the outside of the glass. So they got a translucent effect where the light bounces back and it seems like it's sort of got an oyster-like sheen on it. So they really understood how to do things, but these weren't scientists. These were makers. These were people who just did it day in, day out, day in, day out, day out, and they learned what was possible and what was not possible. They could see, they knew how hot the temperature was. They didn't have thermometers. They didn't have gas ovens. They only had charcoal. It's incredible what they could do. And we can't beat this today, right? We cannot beat this. This is the state of the art. But the funny thing about the Chinese is that they never went on to develop glass itself. They preferred it as a glaze on their ceramics. And it was in the West that glass makes its next big transition, which is in fully large pieces of glass, which were then honed into lenses. And these were used, first of all, to make beautiful chandeliers. And then Galileo, well, actually, he nicked the idea from the Dutch, to make telescopes. And this changed the whole of our view of the world. This changed everything about where we thought we were in the world and the solar system, because without a telescope, you can't see the planets, you can't see the moons, and you can't see that you can't really prove that we go around the sun, and that other planets have moons, and that's what he showed, and that's amazing. But he didn't. He took a material that had already been conjured up by artists and craftsmen and makers over thousands of years, and that tradition continued through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, to the point where you have this, which is an amazing structure, but is the first test tube. And without this, without the glass makers in every chemistry lab in the country, chemistry almost doesn't exist as a subject. But it's a revolutionary form, again, driven by craft, art, people mucking about in their labs. If you've ever seen a glass maker make glass, you will know that they can do things that no one else can do. You couldn't, and it's only because they play around with the material on a daily basis. And there's a different skill to actually doing something. And of course, the city changed because of plate glass, and motion pictures changed because of. Does anyone know what material this is to do with glass? That changed forever. Film and motion pictures. Any guesses? It is Jaws itself, made of fiberglass. Yeah, I know. Fantastic, fantastic material. So you have these little fibres of glass, and if you pull glass out and out and out, it's not a very stiff material anymore. You can bend it, you can wrap it around your hand, and that's a miraculous thing to discover. And then if you're playing around with that and you have a few lasers hanging around the place, you're going to find that actually you can shoot light down it. And you can see immediately that those kind of discoveries don't get made a priori by someone sitting down with a piece of paper or discussing multi-scale physics. It's someone who's actually using the material on a daily basis and fiddling and playing around with it. And I guess that's really what I want to say mostly today, is that there is a huge, huge history in the development of materials and engineering, which is all about mucking about and playing with things, which is not. I'm not just saying it's important because I happen to like it. It's de facto where we've come from. And this is a great example of a material where this was really kind of created for a bet to prove the structure of gels. And this is aerogel. It's one of the lightest materials in the world, and it's 99% air, and it's very, very beautiful. And again, another material that's all born out of just that spirit of inquiry in the lab, and not theory. So I guess I want to say, how am I doing for time? Okay, roughly. Okay, good. That materials, you sort of think immediately. You think, okay, we understand them. They have strength and ductility, and they have all these numbers associated with them, and people will tabulate those numbers, and they're important things to know. If you're building a bridge, you need to know those numbers. But that isn't the whole story. Materials are developed, made, both historically and now, and owned by all different types of makers. And they are all no less or important than from each other, and that's why the people involved in the Institute are from all these different backgrounds, and that's why we need to get those people to work, welcome those people to work together. And you can't predict where the next strange discovery will come, but you're more likely to get it, in my view, if you have a diverse set of people who care about materials, like mucking about with them. And then my argument really is that if you like mucking about with it, you discover something new, you then want to know how far you can push that phenomenon. And that's when theory comes in. That's when you really want to get someone like, what is actually happening here? We've seen something strange, but now we want to understand it. And that's where the science and engineering comes in. But often the first bits are really about play. Now, I want to show you an example of a project that we did, which you're going to get to taste. So how many projects do you hear about and then get to taste on the same evening? So Zoe, Martin and I were thinking about the fact that we were interested in different materials. We built a materials library, and we liked the idea of building things all the same shape but out of different materials to see what they would be like. Because things in the modern world tend to have settled down into a particular material for a particular job. And in the case of spoons, it's stainless steel. Now, there's a whole history for that subject which we could go into, which I won't have time for now. But we thought, does anyone really know why different spoons of different materials taste different from each other? And then we thought, do we actually know that they do taste different from each other? And we thought, well, yeah, because when you go to a takeaway place and you get the wooden spoon or you get this plastic spoon, it's a different experience in your mouth than if you get the stainless steel spoon. And we thought, well, is it really, or is it just that it's, Is it just that we think that? And, you know, anecdotally, you can think anything you like. So we thought we'll do an experiment. Make all these different spoons, and these, in fact, are all stainless steel spoons of the same type, all electroplated with different materials. So we've got zinc, copper, gold, tin, silver, chrome, and stainless steel. And do a blind taste test. So people putting spoons in their mouth, and here are the spoons, but you'll see some more sets of it downstairs, and telling us what they thought, whether they thought the material, that particular experience was a metallic experience, or was it a bitter experience, or was it a sweet experience, and rating it from on a scale. What did we find? Well, you might think you're not going to find anything really very interesting, but we found not only that people could really differentiate between the different materials in a blind taste test, but when you plotted them against this thing called the standard electrode potential, then they actually had a rather kind of, quite a strong correlation with that. And the standard electrode potential is what you might first go to if you thought about reactivity in the mouth. Like, what is the taste experience? We're all used to tasting things using a spoon and not really tasting a utensil, because stainless steel, it turns out, is incredibly inert, and that's, of course, why it's a great material for eating. But most other metals are not inert. They have a certain reactivity, and they can react in your mouth. And the reaction products, some of them you can taste. And we thought, well, it could be as simple as how reactive that material is. And this, so we're plotting how bitter people thought the different spoons were versus this electrode potential. And what's extraordinary is just the correlation, that it actually sort of is as simple as that. Now, that's not to say we know the mechanism of the taste. In fact, having done this work, we found other people around the world who are doing spray tests. So they'll take a spray of a particular molar quantity of one of these ions, like copper ions, or zinc, or tin, and spray it into people's mouths and look for the concentration gradient. And I want to tell you this partly because you're going to get to taste them downstairs, but partly because it spun off a whole series of thoughts in our heads and a whole series of research articles which we had published in various different articles in various different journals. One of which is that there's now evidence that if you've got a cold and you take vitamin C with additions of zinc, you get over that cold much quicker. So, okay, so now you go to Boots and you'll see on the shelves vitamin C with zinc, and that's why, because there's now evidence that it's helpful. But what you don't see is a zinc spoon, do you? No. What if you were eating your orange with a zinc spoon? Would you not get little bits of zinc? You would. And for those born with a silver spoon in their mouth, could it be that there are some miraculous medicinal qualities about small amounts of mineral mineral additions that you get via different spoons? So you can see a whole set of different sort of medical applications here. There's a whole set of medical, and once we published this work, people came to us and said, you know what? There are all sorts of things that happen to your mouth and your taste when you have different diseases. And what if you could develop a spoon which you ate with every day, and essentially, basically, meant that if that spoon started to taste different, that you might be getting a certain disease. So if it started tasting bitter, you think, I'm getting breast cancer. Or it started tasting sweet, you might be thinking, I'm getting athlete's foot. I know it sounds trivial, but actually, the idea that your cutlery might diagnose any ailment you have isn't beyond, in my view, the realms of possibility. We've been to the moon, right? That seems much, much harder. And I like this idea of the cutlery and the table becoming much more part of your kind of health regimen, just like your toothbrush is. So I'm not going to show you the rest of the results because I don't want you to know what actually we found in the study. Because I want you to go downstairs and try it. And if you want to come downstairs, there's 2 experiments you can try. One is the full set of spoons, and with 3 different foods. So we followed this up with some other studies on different creams that you could eat and whether it changed the taste of the cream, and also on touching materials, whether if you touch a material, sighted or unsighted, whether it feels different. And you can look those up online at our website, which I'll show you in a minute. But don't before you've tasted it, because what you've got to do is experience these things for yourself. So you can come downstairs and have those. We've got 3 different things for you to eat. A cream, sort of yogurty, delicious thing. A tomato soup, a slightly spicy tomato soup. and some guacamole dip. Now, I know what 3 material spoons I think will taste best with those 3, and it isn't always the stainless steel spoon. But you must make up your own minds. Now, because we're space limited and it's quite hard to run these things for everybody, we thought we'd like to give everybody, and perhaps you're not that interested, I mean, fair enough. It's weird spoons. Not everyone gets into spoons. So, what if you're just having a bit of a drink downstairs and larging it up? What will come round are some of those 3 dips with 3 different materials that you can taste them from very quickly. And one is a stainless steel spoon as your kind of control. The other is a plastic spoon, which you get in a takeaway shop. But you might also get a wooden spoon, so-called more environmentally sound. Is it, I ask you? I don't want to bias you. I'm not going to say any more. Try the 3 dips with the 3 materials. Tell me that they don't taste the same, or tell me that they taste the same, and I will tell you that you can't taste at all. We've done other experiments, and I think there is a huge market out there for a proper, environmentally sustainable spoon that tastes good. And I don't think we have one today. So there's another opportunity. Are we ready to go? Okay, sorry. So that is the essence of the Institute of Making. We're at UCL. We have a materials library, which I haven't talked about. We do research and development, which I have talked about. And we also believe that intrinsically what we're trying to do is promote excitement and interest in the science and engineering of materials and how it overlaps with design and art and anthropology and history and English and all the gamut of subjects. Go to our website if you want to know more, and you shall be appraised of it. Okay, thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Mark. I noticed he didn't say that the gold spoon would be handed around in the reception. I think I can guess why that might be. Now our next presentation, which will be from David Edwards, who teaches at Harvard. I know I mentioned that earlier, but what I didn't mention was where he teaches and what he teaches is at the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. So please welcome David Edwards.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here, and what a fabulous presentation that was. In a way, Mark, you were talking about materials and why they matter. And what I'd like to do is talk about how really the process of how we create new materials that matter. And in a way, this is a story of an applied mathematician, engineer, chemical engineer who sort of unexpectedly was approached by a venture capitalist in the late 90s, having never left the university, published an article in Science related to delivering big particles into the lungs to ultimately deliver insulin without injections, and said he was interested in betting on my dream, which sort of frightened me that somebody took me that seriously, actually. And so I kind of was nervous about that, and I took a year off, and the company sold. And I came back to Harvard University in the early 2000s, sort of having a radically new impression of what learning was all about. Not that I really understood it, but I understood that I had left the university thinking I knew everything I needed to know, and I was coming back, having left, having learned everything that seemed to have mattered to me. And so I was wondering what that was. I spent a few years at Harvard working with many different kinds of students from different kinds of concentrations, from literature to physics, and ended up coming to the realization that, for me at least, the creative process that had been kind of working in my mind since I was a little kid was working in the minds of not only other engineers, but other writers and architects and medical doctors, and that fundamentally the process was an artistic process, and that what we lacked, as I started to get together with people who had been sort of crazily creative as I had been, and I mean crazily creative in that these were people who tended to be so attached to an idea that they'd run into an institutional wall, and then we know to walk away from those walls, but they did not, and just kept banging their head against that wall until it broke. And And that was the greatest moment in their life. And suddenly they realized, well, that's how discovery is made. And then they spend the rest of their life banging down walls. But none of the institutions really want to know about it because it's actually not good to break down institutional walls. So it occurred to me that a new space needed to exist where those walls didn't exist, where the vocabulary was not a scientific vocabulary, but an artistic vocabulary, and where we did experiments, fundamentally art and design experiments at frontiers of science. And I left Cambridge, went to Paris, my wife is French, and started this laboratoire. And you're looking at it right now. This was an experiment we did with an Indian artist, Shupagupta, exploring the psychological roots of political terror, which is not obvious in looking at that. But basically, we've done 15 experiments since we opened in 2007, and we alternate between contemporary art and design, and we tend to patent things before we do the design projects. I'm often involved in those with lots of other people. And not that we know anything about their potential. In fact, we try not to know anything about their potential. What's important is that these dreams be so sort of wild that the process of exploring them is culturally interesting. And then if something looks interesting, we quickly prototype it and put it for sale in this lab store, which becomes another kind of cultural exhibition. I've written about these labs, which exist in other places too, in a couple books. A first book that was kind of describing how that idea actually emerged, and then the lab, both published by Harvard Press. But what I'd like to do here in the maybe 15 minutes I have left is talk about a couple ideas that are related to what you're going to breathe into your mouths downstairs and other things, but really to emphasize this process of invention and innovation, which for me really are one and the same process, and involve this fusion of what we sort of conventionally think of as art as process, which is sort of intuitive, imaginative, inductive, sort of true in a certain sense. It's very much not what we think of as truth in science, which is more analytical and obviously deterministic. Those fuse, I believe, in the process of innovation in any innovator's mind, whether it's an artist or a scientist or whatever it is between those two poles. So let me begin with the first idea, which is something that came up just before I opened the laboratoire. I, as I mentioned, had done things related to breathing medical aerosols into your lungs and started a few companies. I was having lunch with a French chef, Thierry Marx, in the summer of 2007, and kind of very nervous about opening this center in the center of Paris. We're going to do art and design experiments at Frontiers of Science. Believe me, nobody understood what that meant, and I hardly understood what that meant. And I was with Thierry thinking, well, this could be an artist. And as Mark was saying, I'll stand over here so you don't have to bend your neck. Anybody can be an artist in this kind of and so anyway, we were talking and we had a couple things to drink, and I said to Thierry, you know, maybe you could breathe food into your mouth. And he said, yeah, that'd be cool. And so I went to some students at Harvard and got them thinking about, what if you could breathe food in your mouth? Just think of all the ways we put it, food into our mouths since the beginning of time. Nobody's ever really sort of fundamentally figured out how you could breathe things into your mouth and not into your lungs, of course. And so anyway, we ended up coming up with something called the WIF, what I called the WIF. And this was the first exhibition. Thierry was doing part of the exhibition, and we had this WIF bar. And it was just after they had outlawed smoking in cafes in Paris, and so people were pretty stressed out about that. And the traditional experience of a cigarette and a coffee with a little piece of chocolate was replaced in our bar with you drank your coffee and you smoked your chocolate. And so anyway, that was our experiment, and people got a kick out of it. They didn't really know why they were doing it. And it didn't work very well. We had students running back and forth and filling these things with chocolate. But that seemed to be a success to us, not that we really, again, thought that this would ever be a commercial product. But we continued with it, and without kind of going into all the details, it became clear after a couple years that there were actually major healthcare benefits possible. You could do a lot of things. You could deliver all the essential vitamins and other things. I had actually one of your own Tom Hadfield, who is one of the whiz kids here from England, who started a company and sold it when he was not even finished high school. And he ended up being a student of mine at Harvard, and he joined me in this adventure, and we decided, you know what, we should do a business plan. Maybe there's a company here. And so we started a company and launched something called the AeroShot, which is a first product, which launched in January in the United States, and created a lot of buzz, and of course the FDA said, "Oh, what's going on?" Actually, and so of course we had done this right, and so the FDA looked at it and said, "Great," and so we are now, 10 months later, the product's selling in 18,000 stores in the United States, and a much larger kind of platform is emerging, where a reloadable platform where we can. Just take this out here a second, which will be launching here very soon, where you basically have these little pods that you have all kinds of nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and supplements, coffee, and why not pizza? And so we're exploring applications ranging from energy to over-the-counter and vitamin kinds of nutrients, and also foods. Well, as we're thinking about these delivery systems that are based on dry material, it seemed, well, why could you not also deliver liquids to the mouth through the air? And so we invented this thing that we called the WAF, which I was working with a designer, Marc Bretillot, a culinary designer in France, and we did an exhibition, and the idea was, could you make this cloud sort of dense enough that if you sipped it into your mouth, you actually had a really interesting culinary experience? And how would it kind of the changing the olfactive and gustatory experience change your food experience? A couple years later, a product just this fall came out called the WAF, and you are going to experience it downstairs. We did, at this point, there are a number of leading chefs in the world who are using it, including Massimo Bottura from Modena, Osteria Francescana, and here he is making his signature cloud is a Parmesan cloud, actually, and so the idea is that you sip, so this cloud falls into your glass, and then you sip it out with a special straw. So downstairs, you are going to have 5 different clouds that you can experience, among other things. And so I would recommend that you start with the Scotch cloud, and then you go to there's a passion cocktail. There's a couple coffees that are fascinating, and then you end with the cucumber vodka. Now, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I'm not going to be able to leave here and drive. But the good news is that there's essentially no alcohol coming into your body, because, in fact, in this glass there's about 40 microliters of liquid. So it's like essentially no alcohol. And yet you'll see there's quite an experience. It's very transient, but it's a very pleasant way of exploring. And the coffee is just a fascinating way to explore new coffees. So that's the company that Tom is heading up. And meanwhile, I'm just going to do quickly this. How much do I have? Okay, I'm good. All right, I'm going to go through a second idea here. And again, these ideas begin in a very educational, kind of pass through a cultural phase, and we're constantly looking for a way that we're rewarding the process. We're trying to make the motivation for and the obstacle, kind of the motivation for exploration high and the obstacle to failure low. And I'll kind of illustrate this by this other project, which in 2008 I gave some students this idea to how could the biological cell, so Mark was pointing out how brilliant the biological cell is, teach us how to carry water better in a world where water access is very difficult. And so the cell, among other things, carries water around pretty well in the body. And so students began to work on this, and they were really interested in problems of the developing world, and we do a lot of work in South Africa. And so here's William, who's in his kitchen, and William goes every day and brings water from a well, not too far from his home, and it's in jerry cans, and it's exposed to the atmosphere, and it's kind of full of lots of things. And so it was this kind of Williams problems that were in their minds. And so we ended up involving, again, a really interesting designer, Mathieu Lehanneur, and developing what ultimately became the cell bag, and which then was distributed in this community in the northern part of South Africa, the Moratel community, and so just go back here a second. So it's a bag. You're going to see in a second little kids wearing it, and they've been there's hundreds of kids that are using this right now to carry water back and forth to school. But the cell bag, like the cell itself, can grow, and so you can attach these bottles. And so William now goes and particularly for his drinking water, and he can carry this without having to put it on his head. And then when he gets home, he takes these apart, and then they fit into the bags that the kids are carrying. And so the kids, incredibly, what we've sort of discovered in this experiment is that what is really lacking is not so much access to water. It's the water that is with you as you're walking to school or as you're walking to work. They generally don't have ways of doing that is convenient and safe. And anyway, so that's a project, and I mention this project because from that came another idea, which is a food idea. And so while thinking about, and this is another really important point about innovation, it sort of never stops, or it never should stop. And you should never kind of believe that you've really figured anything out, which is kind of totally the affect of Mark as he's talking. It's kind of this humility, and I think that most people who do this kind of thing are constantly looking at what could they have done better. And so as thinking about the cell and the cell bag, and there's quite a big difference between the cell and the cell bag, it kind of sort of occurred to me, one of the things about the cell, which is interesting, is you can't really empty it out of its contents. You can't kind of, like me, right? So the package is sort of indissociable from the packaged good, which is very unlike what we do with the bottles that we drink and empty out. And so and then obviously fruit is this way, like an orange. And so I was started to think about, well, maybe there's a new way to package food. And like, well, new and old, actually. This is exactly how the orange works. And so you see a couple layers here on the orange. It's a lot clearer on the coconut. So it's often nature has a soft skin, like a grape skin or like my skin, that keeps moisture inside. And then it has a protective shell, like my clothing, that then basically protects this inner skin, and the skin protects the shell. And that's often, so probably the best way that we've ever known to carry water is the coconut. And biodegradable and edible and all of that. And so could we, make these kinds of packages for food? And so this led to an exhibition with another designer, François Azembourg, and this here, so we can show that up there. So there was kind of this sort of, there was sort of this graph kind of all, how the idea sort of evolved and went this way and that way, and we were really early stages. For a couple of years, we then experimented with this, and then what came of it is something we call wiki cells. So wiki cells are basically food, any kind of food really, from water to cheese, to yogurt and other things, as I'll show you, is covered in a skin. It looks just like actually cheese with herbs on it, right? But in fact, this is a skin that is a protective skin, and so it protects water from leaving and oxygen from entering. And so you eat it, but if you leave it outside, it gets hard like a Gouda cheese. Or the ice cream wiki cells, we call these wiki cells, ice cream. What's interesting, it looks like a chocolate chip cookie, cookie dough covering ice cream. This is a coconut covering mango ice cream. You cut it, looks like an egg. And so these are little things that you can just bite into, and you would think, well, that's like an ice cream bar. But in fact, if you put it in the microwave and heat it up, the ice cream stays inside. And you can kind of put a straw into it and drink it. Or if you go outside and it's hot, it kind of hangs in there and it doesn't kind of fall all over you. So it's a really interesting, so you get rid of the primary packaging that would normally go around the ice cream, and now it's completely edible. And you're saying, well, what if I give it to my son, who gives it to his brother, who gives it to his brother, for it's sure it's dirty. And what do? It's like fruit. You can drop it in water and wash it, yogurt, instead of having the fruit inside, the fruit becomes the skin. These are electrostatic gels, particles, little particles of fruit or any food particles tend to be charged, and you can gelify them with nutritive ions, among other things. And so it's all natural. And so we're developing this. I started out by talking the orange, and so you can make oranges. Looks like an orange, feels like an orange, but you stick a straw into it and you drink it, and it's orange juice. And so we're developing this in something that's called WikiCell Design, which is a new company. And if you're interested in eating WikiCells, I don't have them here tonight, but we have the Wiki Bar. It's just opening in Paris, and it's right now private tastings. If you're interested in private tastings, just send us a note, and then we'll begin to sell these things commercially later this coming spring. So these products are coming to you here in England next summer, and we hope to be getting very nice emails from you. Okay, thank you very much.
Stage. I don't know about you, but I love the idea of having a signature cloud. I think mine would be Sauvignon Blanc. Right, well, we have some time for questions from the floor before we go and do our tastings. There are some roving mics, so if you do have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the microphone to actually come to you so that we can all hear what you have to say. I'd like to kick things off, if I may. Mark, you mentioned about the importance of play. So do you think this is lacking in other engineering types of courses where you can have that time to simply play around with what you're actually creating?
I think the urge is there. I just don't think the facilities are. I think that we've kind of created places of education where you'll get introduced to these techniques, which are sort of rows of tables, and if and then there'll be a workshop and no one's allowed in it because you haven't had the right training, and actually people would rather you were out of it. And so what happens is that you get all these messages back, which you could push through those doors, and you could make, or your dad or your mum might have a workshop at home, or they might be a maker themselves, but actually the world has kind of put up lots of barriers. I'm not blaming anyone in particular, but I think we just don't have that kind of mucking about space in the same way that you do actually with sport, right? Sport, you have field, you have football, you don't really need very much to start mucking out and kicking the ball back and forth. Now, it's the kicking ball back and forth thing. Do those spaces exist for making at all ages? And I just think they've shrunk away.
David, you've obviously gone out and done it yourself. You've sort of created your own play space, effectively, with the science and food and working with artists. What enabled you to do that? Was it purely, you sort of hinted at it, the fact that you'd done well with your companies and were able to use that to set it up?
Yeah, well, if I can just quickly say, I think that it's pretty amazing what Mark has done to actually build such a making space in a university. We all love our universities that we're associated with, but for all the right reasons, they become very specialized, and sort of create that kind of a no barrier space inside an institution is a great success. But yes, we created, and so partly it was having made money and selling a company, having never imagined, I grew up very modestly there, and it was sort of a shock. I also sort of didn't feel like I'd grown up, and so it all happened too quickly to me, and so it was kind of a crazy thing to do, but yes, for sure, so there's a couple things. One, I think it was the way I grew up. I didn't really enjoy school. I kind of went through life thinking I knew I was made for something, but I couldn't figure it out, and it was sort of the people who were really inspiring to me were people who were basically saying, hey, David, we don't really know either, right? And so there was this kind of a few people in my life. And I think that memory meant a lot to me. And then there was kind of a ultimate, just kind of crazy act in getting it started. But I want to just make a final comment that this wouldn't have gone on at all, probably 2 days, had I not, from the first day, had amazing people approach me who I had no clue, were out there, and particularly in Paris, and suddenly kind of found my family through this. And so I think what you would probably say too, Mark, what's fascinating in creating these kinds of environments is that it's actually the people who create those environments. And you meet all of these sort of like-minded people, and it's sort of addictive.
Your approaches differ subtly, though, don't they, in terms of how you approach?
Yeah, I think so. It's. I mean, I guess I kind of feel that I have gone down a road which is to sort of hang out with people who, these sort of family people that I, you know, Martin, Zoe, and that's the team where I feel like these are people outside the engineering establishment who've got a lot to offer it, and not quite knowing what we're going to do together, but we muck about. We have, you know, we used to go play golf actually because to just have ideas, and we go, we'll have a meeting. Where? Next Friday. Which course are we going to play? And you just couldn't know. And was that a good use of my time? I think it was, because you know you're not going to have ideas sitting at your desk. And I don't know, but I get the impression that you're, you know, you start with a scientific principle which you can patent, and then think, what can we do with it? Is that a fair assumption, or is that not?
It's actually I think it's so we begin with ideas that are catalysts to learning, and so these are big art and design dreams that none of us know how to realize, but that we try to infect young people with, who of course inevitably move them in different directions often. And so I would say 99% of what we do never ends up getting patented. But it's true that the kinds of ideas that I sort of talk about that really come out and become sort of publicly interactive do get protected. Even if it's a cell bag going into Africa, it's helpful to actually be able to, for partners and everything. And so it's kind of it's really the Bauhaus model. If you look at how the Bauhaus, their aspiration originally was to have products coming out that would fund, by selling, would fund and make it autonomous. And so that's kind of our goal. But it's a lot of things going on there.
Questions from the floor? Yes, we have a question at the front here, and then gentleman on the third row.
Thank you. First of all, it was fascinating to hear both of you talk. I think that, you know, this world that you're talking about is so fascinating, and then coming from an education background, when you go into schools where they're teaching, you know, engineering or science, it's kind of this boring, have to follow the curriculum. So what would be your proposal, if you could, to bridge this gap of going from really, you know, creative people that are talking here to actually connecting to young people that are highly talented? You might see them creating amazing stuff on YouTube, but actually in the school environment, or even, you know, in the evening, there's no extra space for them to actually create.
Well, I'll make a first shot at that. I feel like we probably have two things to say or more, but just I think what's really important is that we make it clear to young people as early as possible that we're ready to bet on their dreams, that their dreams can matter. So I think normally that happens in a normal education if you hang in there long enough. Late in that education. Firstly, it's sit down, don't talk, listen to me, and it's like that for a long time. And there's some moment where suddenly people are looking and say, "Now, do you have an idea?" But that's pretty much late in the game, and it's like, "But I've been listening to you all this time. How can I have an idea?" And so, I think we need to teach calculus. We need to teach, you know, Shakespeare. But we need to create oases where we kind of say, now go, and you matter too. Your ideas matter, and you can dream, and it matters, and people who can bet on that. So I think basically certain families do that, certain schools do that, certain people do that, but we need to institutionalize that, I think.
Mark?
Yeah, and I think then you need a place for it to happen, I would say. And I would say that's a sort of workshop-y environment which has got a place where you can do some electronics, you can, you know, make your own pigments, you can muck around with egg whites, you can bake bread. You know, a place where, because I live in a state, in a council estate, and there are problems, right? And everyone's always solutions to this problem of kind of adolescents kind of vandalising things or breaking things or smoking on the roof or throwing bottles off the roof, which is the latest, is like, we need CCD cameras. And they're like, no, we need a workshop. That's what we need. We need a place where these guys or girls can mend their bikes or build a bike. They can build a motorbike from scratch. They can design a new wherever they want. Because there isn't anywhere, literally anywhere they can do that. Not at school, not at home, right? And there's never going to be anywhere in their future that they're going to be able to do that. And that's such a shame. That's a ridiculous shame.
What about style of working? Because it's interesting what you say. I visited a software engineer company once who make all the games. They make Tomb Raider and things like that in Britain. And all their software engineers, well, very few of them were there because they let them work when they wanted to work. So a lot of them liked to work at night. So they would come in at 10 o'clock in the evening and work till 6 o'clock in the morning. And they also had areas where they would just sit on a beanbag and watch TV and play games for a bit. Or play football. Obviously you need a lot of trust here that you will, but it obviously worked because the company is incredibly successful. Do you think it's also about style of working too?
Yeah, I suppose so. I mean, I think school is a different environment, isn't it? Because actually, essentially, school is formatting people, isn't it, to work in offices and factories. I mean, it's a much bigger question about that, isn't it? And I'm not, yeah, and I can see that this is a political issue as well then, as soon as you realise that. But especially when you get to university, which is an environment I know very well, is that we want our makespace to be open 24 hours a day. Because why shouldn't it be open 24 hours a day? You know,
Yeah.
that'd be just great. And as you say, people want to work.
Especially students.
And it's a very good use of the space and time. So getting it to happen is a lot of paperwork, and hopefully we'll get there. So hopefully in a year's time we'll be able to tell you, we're going to say that we've succeeded.
Right, take a question here. Anybody else who please put your hand up so we can get the microphone to you? Great, there's a microphone at the back there.
Hi, before I ask my question, I just want to build on this particular topic about creative discipline. I've worked in creative media for 25 years, and this is the first lecture I've come along to here where it really resonates with the kind of disciplines you get with visual creative media. That whole process of innovative learning can be turned on its head through what you traditionally taught at school. At school, is a mantra or a discipline that's built into you to not fail. Whereas within creativity, arguably the best discipline is to encourage failure, and by failing often, you succeed quicker. And the two, I know it sounds like a contradiction, but the two benefits of that are, one is through an iterative process, through not fearing failure, you get your ideas down on paper, and it leads you to where you need to get to. Or through that process, through lateral thinking, it takes you off in a completely different direction. So through a discipline not being disciplined, you actually get to your answer. And I think what both Mark and David have referenced tonight really resonates with creative media in terms of how you go about that process. And it kind of contradicts everything that you taught at school, which is get the answer right and get it right first time. So that, I just wanted to add to that. But my question, which is a little bit more mundane, is aimed at Mark and coming back to the spoons. How much does the temperature of the spoon, or the temperature of what you're tasting, or indeed the ambient temperature at which you're tasting that in, affect the taste of the food?
Okay, we don't know. We haven't done that. Because we haven't done that experiment. We did it all at controlled temperatures for the reason that we wanted to control that variable. But we did hypothesise that people would be able to taste the difference between that different metals would feel cooler or less cool on each other depending on thermal conductivity of the metal. And we found they couldn't tell the difference between that at the temperatures we tested them at, which was room temperature going into the mouth. Probably because actually all metals are basically very good thermal conductors. So the nuanced difference between, let's say, copper, which is really excellent, and stainless steel, which is less good, are probably not easy to detect, or at least we didn't have enough stats to see it. But then when we went on to these touch experiments with blindfold, we found something really interesting, which is that seeing the material and feeling how warm it is and how rough it is, they interpreted it completely different. They could see it or not see it. So we had some plastic samples which they thought were quite warm. The people who did the experiment, But when they could see it was a plastic, they then thought it was cold. I mean, cold, cooler, but they were the same temperature. And that was quite interesting. And so there are lots, probably a lot, it's a gold mine of different effects that you can, and I think cooks and chefs know this. See, they've done it from completely the opposite direction. They kind of, and designers, they know these things anyway because they muck about with them and play with them, and they come across a phenomenon which they like to explore. And I think what we've done is sort of go, there's something interesting, let's do a very laborious way of science looking at it. And the other interesting question is whether scientific approach is actually very good for this. I mean, it's taken us a long time to eke out some very few facts. One about the electrode potential, which we're very proud of, but the other ones about heat and about roughness have been much harder to get our teeth into it scientifically. But I think people probably know them from an experiential point of view quite well.
All right, let's take a question from the back there, please.
Thanks, Rick Hall from Ignite. Just to put a little plug in for the need for creative spaces, Mark will know about Lab 13, Fab Labs, hack spaces and so on, community workshops. But my question, I hope, draws Mark's latest appearance on Dara O'Brien's Science Club and David's interest in breathable foods and substances. The last Science Club was related to brains and brain functions, and how actually Alec Jar went off and looked at drugs that will enhance brain functions. And I just wondered, David, whether you felt that inhaling brain-enhancing drugs is a route that you may wish or may not wish to go down.
Well, I'm not going to be quoted on that one. So just to, I will frontally answer that question, but let me say that in the breathing food technology, it's the act of breathing, but everything falls out in your mouth, and so that's to be really pointed out. However, it's true that in the liquid systems, the fact that you're making these liquids into small little droplets, you're increasing the surface area allowed, you're increasing the vapor, and so there's clearly, and that's one of the fascinating things about the WAF and something we call the WA, which I didn't talk about, which is a smaller one. What's interesting is that there's clearly a pretty significant olfactive thing going on, and at that point, there's clearly some very interesting cerebral consequences. We are exploring so again, I didn't really show this, which Philippe Stark was involved in designing this little hand thing, which kind of looks what I was just showing, but it's liquids, and so we're kind of exploring this notion of mind perfumes as things that could kind of, so I'm having done work in the pharmaceutical space, and I'm fascinated by the potential, the healthcare potential of foods, and these kinds of experiences that we're constantly confronted with these really interesting olfactive experiences, but they haven't really been engineered to be necessarily beneficial to us, and so I'm fascinated so in that sense, yes.
You described it as a transitory experience, and when I heard that, it almost sounded like drugs, like a hit. Could you become addicted to your whiff and your waff?
Well, I hope so.
Yeah.
This is actually, it's a very ephemeral experience, and so I think, as you'll see, we will not have a problem tonight with people not wanting to leave. I think that they will eventually leave happily, and you'll be able to close down the Royal Academy of Engineering. But it is so I think that addiction is generally related to a more substantive biochemical experience than what we're delivering. And just a kind of a serious sort of response to that, in the development of all of this, I had a long conversation with David Kessler, who was the head of the FDA at the time when the FDA outlawed smoking. So you can imagine he had a lot of interest in what we were doing. And he was saying one of the real holy grails for him and the FDA is that we have foods, we have drugs, and then we have sensations. And one of the real stories of contemporary times is that we are overdosing ourselves on food and addicting ourselves on kind of medicines to get sensations that don't really require caloric uptake. Or in principle, if we could somehow create a third category, which is sensations, and it's separated from the food and the drug, wouldn't that be interesting? Think of all the problems we could have. So we feel like we're exploring this sensation space with minimal, and so I would say I don't think so.
I do know that some scientists work with chocolate, trying to cure addictions to chocolate by getting people to just smell it.
Yeah.
And to just, I did try it and it didn't work.
Right, so-
I smelt it, ate it afterwards.
Yeah, and just a real quick one. There's a lot of research and interest on the effect on satiation in general and olfactive stimulation. And so the jury's kind of out, but there's clearly an effect there.
And chocolate smells better from inside the mouth. That's the thing.
Yes.
It's designed to melt.
At room temperature, isn't it?
In your mouth, and then you
yeah,
smell it.
not room temperature, at body temperature, isn't it? Yes, thank you.
Lawrence Cullen. I normally work at the intellectual property office, so I was quite keen to hear what you were saying about. First of all, the venture capitalists came to see you and said, "Here, I think this is a great idea. Can I put some money in it?" Now, like how you alluded to the use of intellectual property, and I'm quite keen because some people would say that's anti-competitive. It stops, it cuts people off, other people from coming into the space and playing with the toys and doing different things with it. So how do you square that circle?
So I think, so this is actually a very long conversation. Let me just say clearly here that in what we do, whenever students are involved or any art project that we do, any creator comes in, they own their own intellectual property and it's just completely sandbox and it's not even discussed, basically. If it's my idea, or if it's an idea that clearly has potential, and say students are involved, we will encourage the students to protect that. We spend a lot of time talking about intellectual property right now, as many of you may not know. By far and away, the most valuable property in the world today is intellectual property. And the biggest export by far from the United States is intellectual property. But most of us don't have a clue how to define what is going on in our head in terms of its value. And so we spend a lot of time with kids on that. And do encourage them, before they do exhibitions, to do a provisional patent. And so we do a lot of provisional patents that just never go anywhere, but the exercise, we do that. So the intellectual property becomes if you think of what I described as a funnel of ideas, a lot of ideas up here and nothing's being protected. It's really kind of in the center here when we start to go public, that if we think things have value, we encourage them to be patented, whether or not they're in our space or not. Kids do that. Now, beyond that, I feel strongly that actually intellectual property, you can give it away, but you need to sort of know what it is. And to actually, and it really depends on what is the time scale and the resource need to develop this idea. And if it's pretty short and low, intellectual property patents don't really make sense. And so in a lot of the internet space, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so there's a lot of it where it doesn't make any sense. But I've done a lot of work in the developing world and developing drugs and vaccines for disease of poverty. And I can tell you that over the last 10 or 15 years, as that space has grown, there's a total understanding that you absolutely need to patent so that you can create an economic model. Even if you give everything away, you need an economic model to get big people investing and helping you realize that dream. So it's complicated, but it's at the core of the story.
Mark, how easy is it for engineers to have a traditional research career and yet still explore the unusual, the creative, the different aspects of research that might necessarily take you in the eyes of your peers down a yellow brick road?
I think exactly what David said earlier, which is that we live in a time when you can follow your dreams. Right? Earlier times in history, people, would drop dead because there would be an epidemic of some disease or other. Quite on a regular basis, and they would have to think about the future of their family and take conservative options. But we live in so much opulence and wealth. Like, why would you not follow your dreams? And you should encourage our students to follow their dreams. But the best way to encourage them to do that. So many people
don't know. You say, why would you not?
You've got to do it yourself, because it's all very well saying to someone else, "Oh, you should." If you're not doing it, and I always
so if you're an engineer and you're really interested in, be it a sensation, maybe an auditory sensation, then
I don't see the downside. I really don't see the downside. I mean, what are you risking? You're risking looking like someone who follows their dreams. That doesn't sound like a bad thing to look like. Failure is inevitable, and you have to be able to embrace it. And of course, that's scary. And when I think the hard point is divvying up your time, right? So on the one hand, you've got to follow your dreams. On the other hand, you've got to think, well, I've got to get my research. I mean, from my perspective, I need to be publishing in the mainstream literature to be a credible academic. I can't let that go. I enjoy it anyway, so it's something I like. And you've got different things you're trying to do. You're trying to balance it. I think that's the hard bit. But the fact that you're doing it at all, how much of your time you're going to give to it, even if it's 5% of your time, that keeps me going into work with a spring in my step. And you can't, how many people have to go to work because they have to earn the money? I'm not one of them. I'm really lucky. So, I don't see the downside.
Right. Final question, please.
I was interested in your description of moving into sensations, stepping out of the science and engineering paradigms and thinking about a paradigm of sensation. I just wondered whether you'd looked at the work of people like Hiroshi Ishii at MIT, intangible interfaces, and how that ties in with the sort of physical artifacts that you're creating that actually deal with sensation in that way.
So I studied at MIT, and I have lots of colleagues at MIT who I interact with. But what we do is sort of on the innocent spectrum, far to the right. So we're very innocent in what we do and the kind of projects that we do. So, however innocent this sounds, when we
could you define innocence?
Innocence. Well, innocence.
In this sense.
Innocence. Well, yeah, I use that word a lot. But the first thing I say to students in my class when they come in is that my goal this semester is to help preserve that one thing you most want to eliminate, and that's your innocence. So I believe that innovators are constantly looking at ways to preserve their innocence. I need to define that, but I just want to say how big a thing that is. It has to do with a state of mind that is humble, that is actually really curious, that's kind of sort of a lot of self-doubt, empathetic, and lots of things that we associate with young people who are like not really sure what they're going to do with their life. That, I think, if you look at the serial writer that kind of the book's done and then immediately throws his or herself in front of a blank page, it's like, well, why don't you just enjoy this? But in fact, there's this sort of great pleasure of what am I going to do with that blank sheet of paper? There's something, they like who they are in that moment. And so innocence, I didn't really define it other than, so innocence in terms of I have a dream and I really don't have a clue how to realize that dream. So that's kind of the innocence that I'm referring to. And so in that regard, often we start out in a direction having done zero, in terms of sensations, for example, zero in space. Well, who's doing what? And my students often, good Harvard students, will say, okay, let's go do the literature. So say, no, don't. If somebody's doing it, then you shouldn't even be thinking about it, actually. So and I think what happens in an art, if you're in a master art studio or if you're in a research lab, I think the role of the mentor is to help students see what matters, in other words, what's completely not being done today, and just to kind of push them. And just there's a kind of an instinct that we develop that, that's so far out there, and it's that for sure very likely nobody's there, and so we tend to be developing it. There is a moment when we are now, certainly if we're looking to protect something, we're saying, well, maybe somebody was doing something like this. And so, and we often totally find, yeah, absolutely. And that's where this notion of failure and success, because now you've invested something into it. And so when you see, oh my gosh, he's already doing that, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't sleep at night, and I'm feeling. And so then you figure out, oh, but I could actually go in this direction. And so anyway, I don't have any collaboration like that at MIT, but maybe should.
Well, in a moment, I would like to invite you to come downstairs for our reception. where you can taste some of the innovations that we've heard about tonight. David's team will provide demonstrations of Le Woif and Aero shots. Mark's team will be doing the tasting spoons, putting them into action. And for those of you who don't get a chance to actually take part in that experiment, we've got those different spoons going around, the wooden spoon, the plastic spoon, what have you, and the metal spoons. Even the drinks will be served in glass and plastic. So that means you need to try them from both vessels in order to see which tastes better.
So the idea is that although they all taste different, the combinations are really well. Gold, I know, it's amazing, isn't it? It makes you want to have gold at home. Texture but we haven't published it yet, so I can't talk about it. But you're right, the mouthfeel is everything. And did you taste this one with that?
I'll try that one.
And they go different. It's very interesting. Let me wait. Okay, I'll be back. Who wants to have a go? Okay.
So do you need me for further experiments?
Yeah. No. Get it. And, get 3 more.
Yeah, interesting.
It's actually really complicated to get right.
Yeah.
That's why I'm sort of made stock.
Because
what do you think, Tim? It's not very powerful, it's a bit light. It's like air or something. Yeah. It's like the smell of the stick.
That's weird, yeah.
You can taste it, but it's just like the smell.
Yeah, yeah. Are you feeling going into
That's the problem, isn't it?
Scotch, there's a cookie here. You can try other stands. You have to put the glass here. And take that like if it was a cigarette or a cigar. And you just go to spin, get closer.
I need to come down to you.
Exactly, yeah. And like that, you can feel the taste. It's good?
Very good, yes. Very
And you
good.
can
Our course an arts course and the fine art department becoming a lot more popular. And I think in 5 years probably there will be more of an interest in this sort of interdisciplinary or
in your mouth. So if you were to put the whole spoon in your mouth, the amount that connects with your tongue or the roof of your mouth means that there's quite a lot of metal in contact spoons. So this actual signed spoon is an ideal. I like Mark. I think I like the copper because I'm from up north. Well, it certainly doesn't work with action. And they also did a thing with black cod that equally, when eaten from the copper spoon, you started to get surface on the fish.
what about salty? What about salty? Is that
Completely different than the avocado or the with the yogurt. And it's reacting, there's different acidities in these as well.
Well done. Oh yes, I'm with you. And then you got the you can keep your straw for different flavors. 5 more to go.
Go on, Ian.
No.
So at least you can put any kind of liquid like orange.
You got this one the right position? Yeah. That other? Correct.
What was that you were thinking?
It's going to be possible to but 2 cameras I really would like. You will know.
It's gone flatter. It's gone flatter on that silver one. That one is the same. When it's better. That's the aftertaste is wrong with this. So it's got some water.